name is Kathleen Nichols, and I'm delighted to welcome you back here to Magdala. We're continuing our program, Jewish Feasts and Christianity. And today we're in this small garden very close to the shores of the Sea of Galilee because we're going to continue covering or speaking about the characteristics of Sukkot. We did a first part of the series, if you want to take a look at that, and this is the second half of this feast. In fact, it is called the Great Feast of Joy, or the Feast of Joy. And the reason is because even in the Torah, the Jewish people are commanded to rejoice during this time. And the reason for that, I think there's many reasons, but one of them is because it coincides with the autumn feast. And as I mentioned, behind me you can see an olive tree with these light green olives on it. It's just calling out to be harvested, and God willing, we'll be doing some of that harvesting here in Magdala very soon for the pilgrims who want to participate and see what it's like to harvest olives. But it's not just that, it's apples, as you know, began with Rosh Hashanah. We also have the harvest of pomegranates, which was again started during Rosh Hashanah, as well as persimmons. For those of you who like that fruit, it's beginning to find its way back onto the tables here in the Holy Land. And in modern times, there's mangoes everywhere. It's definitely mango season. And so that in itself is wonderful. But what is it that it says in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 16? You shall celebrate the feast of Sukkot for 7 days, when you have gathered in the produce from your threshing floor and winepress. You shall rejoice at your feast, together with your son and daughter, your male and female slave, and also the Levite, the resident alien, the orphan, and the widow within your gates. For 7 days you shall celebrate this feast of the Lord, in the place which the Lord will choose, since he has blessed you in all your crops and in all of your undertakings. You will be full of joy. And so this is that time of year. What's another characteristic of Sukkot that we didn't get to talk about last time? Well, water. The symbol of water, or the reality of water. Perhaps many of you know that this is a time, well, toward the end of the Feast of Sukkot, it's the time when the Holy Land receives its first rains, and then the rainy season begins, and then everything that's completely dried out right now begins to almost miraculously flourish. If you were to walk the pathways here of Mount Arbel that I'm looking at right in front of me, you'd just be shocked about how dry it is. In fact, in the 3 years I've been here, I haven't seen it as dry as it is this year. And so I'm very much waiting and praying for this time of rain, and that's what they do also here in the Holy Land. So these prayers are sung. We're asking God for rain. I also want to mention, remember how we talked about the Sukkot, the top of it's covered with palm branches, but there's still an opening to see the stars? Well, it's also so that they can sense or witness, give testimony to the fact that it begins to rain. They can feel the first raindrops on their faces when the water comes down from the heavens. Now, the reason they do this, if we go back to the origin of the feasts, right, of this feast rather, when they built these booths going through the desert, this was also a place where the Lord gave the Israelite people water. They needed water to be able to survive in the desert. So what is it that happened during the time of Jesus? Well, when they had the second temple, they would actually, the priests would take a golden vessel, maybe a pitcher or maybe a bowl, and they would go down from the Temple Mount to the Gishon spring, which would have been in the city of David. And that spring fills a pool called the Pool of Siloam. So they would go and they would fill this golden receptacle with water, and they would, in great procession and pilgrimage, go back up to the temple. And once they got there, they would take this water and they would process around the altar of the Lord, and then they would pour it out in a libation. A libation is like a sacrifice, and they would pour it into these holes which were behind the altar in the temple at Jerusalem, and these holes would actually go, there's a theological belief that they would go to the underworld, like to wash the underworld, but it was actually the place where the water would flow out with the blood of the sacrifices in sort of a channel that would end up in the eastern part of the temple in the Kidron Valley. And they actually say that it made the Kidron Valley very fruitful from all of this blood of the sacrifices and the water that was poured out from the temple. Now, I want to make a reference to the Old Testament where it speaks about in Isaiah 12:3, he says, "We will draw waters joyfully from the springs of salvation." He was probably making reference to Sukkot. We sing about that every Holy Week, actually, in the Catholic Church, and so it's very interesting to draw those parallels. So what's a third element that I want to speak about in the second part of the Sukkot video? It's the element of light. Sukkot is the feast of light, feast of joy, feast of water, feast of light, because it's linked, as I mentioned, with the olive harvest. And here in the Holy Land, in ancient times, and even today, you can use oil pressed from olives to light lamps. So if God is a source of water, in a certain way, he's also the source of light during this feast. That's what's celebrated during this feast. And remember what it says when, again, going back to the Israelites in the desert, they were guided by fire by night and a cloud by day. So we're bringing in all of these elements. Now in ancient times, and this would be again during the time of Jesus, during the time of John the Baptist, remember he was the son of a priest, and so he probably witnessed this as a child. There was this great moment during the feast where in the women's court of the temple, they had these very, very, very tall and large pillars onto which they would set this huge fire aflame during the feast. And so the kids of the priests would be able to go and see this, and it was really exciting because those fires were so bright that it lit up not just the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem, but if you read the writings from that time, it says it lit up the entire city as if it was daytime. And it was because they were trying to point to the fact that it was the Lord who guided them as this fire through the desert. Another element, a fourth element I want to mention, is the 4 species. If any of you have any Jewish friends, you know that this time of year they have like this, I don't know, this handful of sticks and branches and things that they wave around their sukkah, if they have a sukkah in their house. And so these 4 species are 4 species of plants, and it comes straight from Leviticus chapter 23, and this is what it says in verse 10. On the first day, speaking of Sukkot, on the first day you shall gather fruit of majestic trees, branches of palm, boughs of leafy trees, and valley willows. So the 4 species right there. And from it, it says, continuing in Leviticus, for a week you are to make merry before the Lord. In other words, you take this and you wave it around in joy. And so now, these days, currently, they use myrtle, palm, cedar, and willow branches. And so that's what you'll see. There's a lot of nuance, a lot of meaning behind those types of plants that you can, look into, but a lot of rabbis have assigned a lot of meanings to those. But then and now, they are used as a procession. When they had the temple, the Jewish people would take these 4 species and they would process around the altar 7 times. And it says they would process with these palms and they would cry out something that might seem familiar to us Christians. And that is the word Hosanna. They would cry out Hosanna. It means save us. Save us, because they're offering up prayers to the Lord. Now the Jewish people will take those palm branches and you'll see them process in the synagogue, or they'll take them, of course, to the synagogue. And then in their sukkah, and sometimes in the synagogue, they'll also take them and they will, rejoice, shaking them in the air, looking north, south, east, and west. And again, it's the universality of this cry of Hosanna, or of save us. So now, how does all of this help us to understand better our Christian faith, going back to the sources of the Jewish feasts? Well, with what we talked about today, first of all, let's talk about the water and the blood that was poured, that comes out the side of the temple, or the water and the wine, rather, this water that was poured in those holes behind the altar and is washed out with the blood. Well, let's go back to what John said in his gospel. Remember that St. John wrote a lot about symbols, and it's interesting when you read about the Lord's side that was pierced with a spear. John underlines that, and it is a huge deal for him. And so Sukkot takes us back to this because, what they do in Sukkot, the holes behind the altar where the water and the wine were poured out, and they went out on the eastern part of the temple to the Kidron Valley. Well, in John 19, there's a specific word he chooses to use in Greek. That word is ura. And in Greek, that doesn't just mean side. It actually almost means like the ribs, the side of a person. And the reason that's important is because he's equating the side of Christ with the eastern side of the temple. He's equating the water and the blood that were poured out from him, from the side of Christ when he was pierced with the lance, to the water and the blood that was washed out from the temple. And toward the east, into the Kidron Valley, that was made fruitful from what was poured out from the temple. Now all of mankind, all of the earth is made fruitful by this sacrifice poured out from the Lord's side. So this is an important thing in John's gospel. Also in his gospel, he makes he underlines a great deal water. If you go to the Gospel of John chapter 7 and also other parts, but specifically chapter 7, the entire time it's set during the Feast of Sukkot. And this is, I want to point out one thing in particular, well, two things actually. This is when Jesus goes up to the temple and he proclaims, I am water, I am the living water. In fact, it says this in John 7:37, if anyone is thirsty, come to me, drink he who believes in me. As scripture says, rivers of living water will flow from within him. He said this in reference to the Spirit that those who came to believe in him would receive. So that's John 7. This Greek word isn't just he's saying this or he's screaming out. It actually is a word which means he is revealing this. He's revealing something about himself. I am this living water. During this time of the Feast of Waters. In other words, I am the true spring. I am the true fulfillment of what is prayed about and lived during this Feast of Sukkot. Now also I wanted to point out in the same time period is when Jesus heals the man born blind. And if you remember that he puts mud on his face and then he sends him down to the Gishon spring, which is collected in the Siloam pool. The man washes in the pool of Siloam. So it's this pool where the water is drawn during the Feast of Sukkot and then poured out as a libation so that we can pray for rain, for life from the heavens. Well, it's interesting what Jesus does and what John underlines during this Feast of Sukkot. It's very clear. And another kind of link that I want to make is the Christian practice of baptism. And I'm going to point it out this way. Remember, we talked about there's 3 pilgrimage feasts for Jewish people back in ancient days. One was Shavuot, which is Pentecost. One was Pesach, or Easter, Passover. And then the third one was during Sukkot. Now, we have a Christian fulfillment in Pentecost, also during Easter, Passover. But there's nothing in the Christian life which is equated to Sukkot, it seems like. There's no big feast. But many academics say, oh, no, it is fulfilled beautifully in baptism, specifically making reference to this whole part about water. But let me read to you a little bit about what John writes in Revelation, the last book of the Bible, and you'll understand sort of this connection a little bit better. If you look at Revelation 7, chapter 14, this is what it says. I said to him, my Lord, who are the one who knows? He said to me, these are the ones who have survived the time of great distress. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. This was in response to a question that was asked, who are these people walking around in white? And so they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they stand before God's throne and worship him day and night, who sits on the throne. And then it says in verse 16, they shall not hunger or thirst anymore, nor will the sun and the heat strike them. And I want to point that out because remember the first video we talked about Sukkot as this cloud which surrounds them, is below them and above them to protect them from the heat and from the sun. And then it says, the Lamb who is in the center of the throne will shepherd them and lead them to the springs of life-giving water. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So not only is he the spring, but he wipes away their tears. In other words, they will be rejoicing and enjoying in this time of feast. And if you look at the ancient baptismal rite, the very first rite that was written, it brings in these specific elements from the Feast of Sukkot, especially water, especially light, especially oil, the things that we talked about today. So there's, again, so much to be said about this incredible feast day here in the Holy Land, and the joy and the rejoicing that you can sense when you're here, the people who are remembering, entering into the grace of when the Lord made a covenant with them and then accompanied them through the desert, giving them food and water and protection and joy because he was with them. So let's give thanks to this, to God for this great grace, and just know that we are praying for you from the Holy Land, and we hope you can join us for the next segment of the series when we dive into the Feast of Light, the next feast day we'll be talking about, which is Hanukkah in December. So God bless you.